Okay, so class number 2, first things first, so administrative stuff. A bunch of you have been already posting to the discussion boards, which is great. Because the discussion boards are kind of complex in how they get graded, right? It's like the interaction of comments. I won't grade them as you post them. I'll choose like a few dates in the semester and I'll just go through all of them, and that'll be kind of like a check-in. If you've been doing it, you'll get to see your progress, but it's not as if like they're not counting for points. They will. It's just I gotta like choose my moments, because otherwise it'll be absolutely insane trying to keep up with it all. So it'll probably be in a few weeks, maybe a month or so, sometime at the half point of the semester on the midterm, probably just before, honestly, so that you can make an informed decision of whether or not you feel as if you ought to take the midterm. So that's thing one. Thing two is I'm going to do an experiment. Okay, so we're going to like do something kind of new and interesting, and I think it's a win-win no matter what happens with the experiment. So I'm going on the job market next year. I really like next semester. And so student evals, what you guys think about the class is absolutely essential to that. All of my employers are going to read it, and you really do have you can make the difference in my ability to get a job or not. So here's the experiment. Because course evals are really important, I'm going to offer all of you, offline, online, in class, whatever it is, 1% of your grade. You get 1 bonus point, which is 1% of your grade, if you promise now to fill out your evals at the end of the semester. Okay. So just send me an email saying like, yeah, I promise to do this, and you'll get points. So just like something that in writing says that you promise to fill out your evals with your name attached, and then you get the 1 extra credit bonus point, which 1% of your grade, difference between 89 and a 90. And I figure like if you don't do it, then it's interesting, right? At least it'll be like a cool promise keeping thing. Like, can you follow through? And if you do, then great, more evals. That's awesome, and will really help me with the job prospects going forward. So keep that in mind if you want to do it. I'll remind you at the end of class too. That's the experiment. So on to the actual course content. We read Plato's Apology for today. Who did the reading? No judgment if you did. Oh, that looks like everybody in class and most of us online. Yeah, so again, part of the construction of this class and the syllabus is to give you the ability to choose the work that you want to do, because I think if you're forced to do stuff, then you're not going to want to do it, and if you don't want to do something, you don't do it well. The one thing that I would like to impress upon all of you more than anything is to do the reading, right? So you're going to learn from being in lecture, you're going to learn from engaging with each other, but you will learn the most by putting your hands and getting them deep into the content of what we are studying, learning, and reading. So good job to those of you who have been reading it. If you haven't, catch up. I mean, this is like, it is where philosophy in the West begins. It is an awesome, awesome read too. So if you do anything, do the reading. And then if you do anything else, pass the course with, whatever you decide is best for you. Okay, administrative stuff over. What is the philosophical life? This is our first big question for today, really the first big question of the semester. I suppose like what is philosophy is kind of one, but this is our first real lecture and our first real big question that we're going to dig into. So for this class, we read Plato's Apology, which covers the examined life. And last time we looked at what philosophy had become after a couple thousand years of doing it through the eyes of Russell. And Russell tells us that philosophy has to do with good reasoning, with the art of thinking and questioning, the science of argument. Sometimes it's even therapy, right? So I find this interesting about my colleagues is that you tend to find that people who do philosophy for a career, they pick a topic that is something that they're either really good at or deficient in, and then use the work, the like deep thinking to completely understand as well as they're able that particular concept or practice. And in that sense, philosophy can be therapeutic. I think even just insofar as we talked about the contemplative attitude and sort of state of peace that comes along with doing philosophy, there is a kind of therapy in that experience as well. And all these are great and might capture a part of what philosophy is, but if we're to understand philosophy rather than just define it, then we have to see it in practice. And there's no better place to see it in practice than where it all begins, at least for the West, which is in Socrates' apology, his defense of himself, written by Plato. Great. So some historical prelude, because this is stuff that you don't get from the book, but it is really important to the story, to the context, that anybody who was reading this, which would have been very few people when it was written, would have known. And everybody in antiquity sort of like knew the history of ancient Greece as well. So what is the political and philosophical scene leading up to what I've now called the beginning of Western philosophy? There were philosophers before. There was Thales and Parmenides and Anaxagoras and Heraclitus, but really we only have fragments of what these guys said. And the way that they did philosophy was different from the way that Plato really originates it, and it inspires a whole philosophical method through the academy that he invents, and that is what we're doing today, is living in the tradition of this guy, Plato. So I mentioned Thales. Thales says, Thales is often called the first scientist, the first person to really think about the world scientifically, to incorporate a method of inquiry, study, analysis, hypothesis, experiment, right? And his conclusion of doing science was that it's all water. It's kind of how these guys worked, is they were doing cosmology, which is the logos of cosmos, the principles of the universe, of nature in general, just sort of everything. And for Thales, water is the principal form of motion, cohesion, unity, and causality that the universe operates by. And he did a bunch of other really interesting stuff. A good Wikipedia dive if you're interested in the first scientist. There's also Heraclitus, who, different from Thales, does not say it's all water, but rather it's fire. Right? This is Heraclitus. Heraclitus is a big influence on Nietzsche, along with Empedocles, another one of these pre-Socratics. But Heraclitus saying it's all fire, it's not just to say like, Avatar, the Airbender, learns how to like shoot fire from his hands and that's what everything is. No. It's all fire is almost metaphor. It's a principle. I mean, so there is some of that. There's matter and potential, and one form of matter is fire, and potential dunamis is the way that matter coheres, moves together, and creates things. And so there's like a little bit of the Avatar stuff going on, but really what it's all fire is supposed to mean is that it's all chaos, right? That things don't flow like water and form elegant curves as they go downhill or whatever. It's just everything is chaos and random. A misquote of Heraclitus, you can't step in the same river twice, right? This is sort of the principle of it's all fire. Then we have Pythagoras. You've probably taken geometry, right, in high school. You know the Pythagorean theorem, right, where everybody's walking like this and Pythagoras decides to go across the courtyard and skip the line. He also had some interesting occult stuff going on, the Musica Universalis, saying that everything in the universe accords to a particular harmonic, that there's like a energy, vibration, frequency, and something that has to do with triangles, I suppose. I don't really know too much about the occult side of Pythagoras. I'm not sure anybody does, but it's out there. Another interesting Wikipedia dive. If you're an English major, have you read Joyce? Metempsychosis is a big theme there. So there's a fun tie-in, a little spoiler for you. And then the last one we're going to look at is Parmenides. Parmenides gets mentioned, or Anaxagoras gets mentioned in the Apology, who's similarly related to Parmenides. So Parmenides is what we call in philosophy a monist. He thinks that there is just one thing, right? So you might be a dualist like Descartes, say there's two things, there's matter and there's mind, which we'll look at in next week or a couple weeks. A monist says, no, there's just one thing. And Parmenides gives a really interesting argument for it. Parmenides says, one, either it is, two, it is not, or three, it is and it is not. talking about everything, right? So either everything exists, everything doesn't exist, or everything exists and doesn't exist. These are the only options, right? Stands to reason. 3 is an incomprehensible contradiction. It doesn't mean anything. If I said that I am purple and not purple, that is a sentence that is meaningless. It cannot be understood. It is a contradiction. Similar here. It is and it is not something that is comprehensible according to Parmenides. Now you get an argument from Aristotle that comes in Physics 1, I want to say, that deals with this problem and is like a direct response to Parmenides in order to explain causality and like the forward motion of time. But for now, in a sort of simplistic, naive view, which I don't mean to say that Parmenides was simplistic or naive, but relative to the intellectual developments of generations future past Parmenides, it does look that way. So anyways, it is and it is not is a contradiction. So 3 is not possible. 2 is a pragmatic contradiction, which is not a contradiction in itself, right? It's not saying something is and is not, right? Has this property and does not have this property. That's like a formal contradiction. A pragmatic contradiction, on the other hand, is another important philosophical term. What a pragmatic contradiction is to say that I am not giving a lecture right now. And it's not a formal contradiction in that it's just a statement, right? I've just said something, but what I'm saying as I'm saying it, that form of my action, in addition to the form of my statement, forms the contradiction. So you have a contradiction in praxis, in action, in the way that things are done, rather than in the like formal logical space that it is and it is not occupies, right? So the pragmatic contradiction of 2 is that things exist. Here they are. It is, right? It is not. It's not. Is, well, what's the simple way of saying this? It is not, right? Is a pragmatic contradiction with the fact that here we are and here we are talking about it. Something is. We're existing right now. Therefore, everything is. It all exists. Existence is complete and total. There's nothing that isn't. There's nothing that is and is not. Everything is. Time, matter, space, all of it is a continuous unity, a monism. So just for fun, does anybody want to try to object? This is a game that we'll play a lot throughout the semester. What's wrong with the argument? And just some like heuristics and rules to help. One strategy for playing the game is to pick a premise and say, that premise is wrong, and then give a reason why. Explain your inference. Another is to say that there's an inference that's wrong. The way that 1 and 2 and 3 cause Parmenides to infer 4 his conclusion, there's a missing step, or there's a misstep somewhere. Or you can say that the argument is incoherent for some alternative reason. It's called like a critique, right? Where you take the argument on the whole and say, well, it's misunderstanding something in general, and so it's misguided. So does anybody want to try to say what's wrong with the argument?
I feel like it's just because things exist doesn't mean that they're all one. How everything exists means that it's one thing.
Great. What's your name?
Sylvia.
Sylvia. So Sylvia says, just because it all is doesn't mean it all has to be one thing. So it's saying that the argument is too bold. It's proving more than it can, or more than it should. And so in a simple argument like this, you might get a monism. But as soon as we dive a little bit deeper, we take a more nuanced perspective of things, we start to see that, okay, maybe it all exists, but it's not all of the same sort, at least. And that seems to be an open possibility within this argument. Good. Anybody else before we move on? See, Parmenides doesn't like that. He's afraid of 2. It's like, no, don't. There's only 1. Okay. So that's the philosophical background in which Socrates is set, right? So Socrates is a wandering ex-military dude, doesn't wear shoes, kind of smells bad. He has a snub nose. And he is living as sort of like the next generation, an in-between generation, an intermezzo of these famous pre-Socratics and his post-Socratic students, which come in and like find their intellectual development in the academy, which would be Plato and Aristotle, right? Plato invents the academy. Aristotle is his graduate student for like 18 years, which is wildly awful. No wonder Aristotle disagreed with everything Plato said. Okay, so that's just the like philosophical background. There's also a political background, which is important to note, especially for like, why is Socrates on trial at all? What are these like informal charges? Is that there's also a political history that we're not told in the book, which Socrates lives 470 399 BC. 10 years prior to his birth, the Greeks defeat the Persians at Salamis. You guys have probably seen 300, right? It's a bunch of oiled up, like many-abbed men stabbing. It's a, yeah, cool action movie, but maybe questionable in today's day and age. Athens, after this victory against the Persians, undergoes a cultural renaissance. They redefine themselves. They become the city-state and opolis that they had always wanted to be, that they had always been sort of fated to be. In their eyes, they start to think and act, and they develop this agrarian economy that like explodes, and it makes them a powerful force on the Peloponnese in Greece. But Sparta doesn't like this. Sparta to the south does not like to see a rival polis become so affluent, rich, powerful, and especially maybe they do like to see it, but only just so rich, powerful, and affluent, because Sparta can now take what Athens has made for itself. So in 430 BC, notice this is during the life of Socrates. He's about 30 at this time. He's a young man. The entire Peloponnese goes to war, which lasts 27 years and ends in 403. Now, Socrates dies in 399, right? So the war begins when Socrates is a young man and ends when he's an old man. And you have like 4 years in between the end of the war and the death of Socrates. And Sparta wins. Sparta absolutely rocks Athens. Athens gets their butts kicked in, and installs puppet tyrants. Right. So these are called the 30 tyrants. Critias is the leader of them. He's a Greek guy who was all about tyranny, but tyranny not in the sense of evil, awful rulers. I mean, they were like probably pretty evil, but tyranny in the sense of like one single monarchical like force of power that rules the city-state, the polis, and does all the governance. Tyranny, yeah, so understood in that way. So Critias is the leader of what are called the 30 tyrants, which are who are the leaders that are installed in Athens after Sparta's domination in the war. And they killed all sorts of people. So think like French Revolution, off of their heads kind of thing. They had rich people they didn't like, dissenters, and political rivals, all just sort of murdered outright. People who had land that they wanted, they were pretty corrupt, right? So this pisses a lot of people off. 1,500 of your rich, powerful, elite nobles from the city are murdered off by these 30 tyrants, and you're gonna ruffle some feathers, to say the least. In 403, 1 year after the installment of the 30 tyrants, Athens is taken back under control by democratic forces. There's a civil war that breaks out, and they overthrow the tyrants. And they offer all amnesty for political crimes, saying like, all right, we want to end this civil dispute. We recognize that you did a lot of murdering, you 30 tyrants and your friends and family, but hey, let's forget about it. Let's try to move forward. So everybody is sort of like, let's wipe the slate clean and restart as a unified Athens. Kind of a cool idea. But there's still a whole lot of under the covers bad feelings. And you can imagine why. So one passage that's really important to note in the Apology concerns Socrates' relationship with his former protege, Critias. Critias was one of Socrates' students, right? So this leader of the 30 Tyrants is one of the kids that followed Socrates around, watching him make fun of other older smart people who claim to be smart, right? Codgy old boomers, right? As Socrates like pokes fun at him. Critias is one of these dudes who is learning this process. And Socrates not only denies being a teacher in general, but also having assisted the 30 in any way, though Socrates was also no fan of democracy. So Socrates, he thinks, and we'll see this in the Apology, with the argument that does everyone corrupt but me? Or what about with horses, right? Does one person make a horse better, the horse breeder, the person who knows how to ride horses? Or is it everybody? Does everybody like pokes the horse, they make the horse better, right? So this is Socrates', or at least Plato's, through the mouthpiece of Socrates at the very least, political ideology, that tyranny is actually pretty good because you have one really smart person who knows what the heck they're doing, and the masses, the mobs, mob justice doesn't do anybody any good. That democracy leads to watered down, washed out politics, and what we really need is, in Plato's language, a philosopher king, someone who's walked out of the cave, seen the world of forms, come back, and they are no longer looking at shadows, but they see things for how they really are and can guide the city-state through to a wonderful, bright future, etc. Right. So this is the draw of your oligarchical or tyrannical sort of political bent that Socrates doesn't ever explicitly, at least so he says, support, but he wasn't too unhappy with it either, right? Because this is kind of like what he wants to see. He wants to see a strong, singular power, and not a democratic ruled by the masses mess. And so what we get in the Apology then is a defense of Socrates, who is being accused by Democrats, right? So these Democrats who were prosecuted under the rule of the 30 Tyrants are now taking out their rage on Socrates. They're saying, hey, you were one of them, and you continue to be a real jerk to everybody. You walk around town like we gave everybody amnesty, and there you are, like poking fun and making us all look stupid, and so we're gonna kill you, right? And so they bring him to a court of law and try to take their revenge, Anytus, Miletus, and Lycon. So the Apology. But I've mentioned a couple of times, this is really important to note, this is Plato's Apology, not Socrates' Apology. I mean, Socrates' Apology, actually, right? He's the one defending himself in the court of law, but it's written by Plato. Socrates didn't write anything down. So when you hear Socrates said this and this, it's really just Plato wrote that Socrates said this and this. And you hear that a lot, that, oh, Socrates used to think this. And it's an open question as to how much of what Plato gives to Socrates and voice through these dialogues, for everybody online, these dialogues, Socrates actually thought. So the predominant view in the secondary literature is that there are sort of three phases of Platonic dialogues. There are the early dialogues, the middle dialogues, and the late dialogues. All of them share a common form, they're dialogical, right? But the early dialogues, which we get in the Apology, Credo, Euthyphro, and Phaedo, the first four, are supposed to be, at least this is like what scholars of Plato tend to think. There's a bunch of arguments in all different directions. The dominant view is that these first four are pretty accurate with respect to what Socrates was talking about. And then you get middle dialogues like the Republic, and I think the Critias is probably one as well, the Meno, all sorts of other ones. And these are kind of where Plato is beginning to take his own step forward and develop his own views, again, using the mouthpiece of Socrates. And so we see a whole lot of Socratic influence, but a marked and distinct change towards a theory of truth and forms, metaphysical realities, not merely the skeptical sort of indifferent wisdom is in not knowing voice that we get in the early dialogues. And then the late Platonic dialogues are very much all about like formalisms and truth and knowledge and the right sort of state and how to interact and whatnot. So you have like the late dialogues read very different from the early ones, but Socrates is the character, the main character of all of these dialogues all the way through. So it's Plato writing, not Socrates, right? Cool. So the apology. Apology just means defense. Apo means before. Logos means speech. It's the before speech. It's what you do before you are tried or committed to a crime. It's your opportunity as a defendant to say, whoa, wait a second, right? Please don't kill me. I didn't do it. And this apology is broken up into three parts. There's the defense, there's the sentencing, and there's the final address. In classical Greece, the way that the courtroom worked was that you would have your apology, your before speech, which would be right after the prosecutors laid their charges. They would levy the charges and say, this person did this. And then the defendant would get to defend themselves, right? And then the jury would vote based on what they thought was true or what they thought was right. And they would only vote on guilty, not guilty. And then if guilty, the accusers get to decide the punishment that they want to impose. And if the punishment is voted down, I think it was just that like nothing happens. I think, don't quote me on that. So you wanted to choose the right punishment that you thought you would be able to get for the crime that you've just convicted your defendant of. And then there's another apology, there's another defense. Like I think that rather than this punishment, I should have this punishment. And then there's a final vote, which is whether or not to give the punishment that the prosecutors levy or the defendants levy. And then it's the end, the final address. So this speech, this apology takes the same form. And its themes are respect for reason over rhetoric, fierce independence, especially intellectual independence, humility and pride with maybe a blend of irony. There's a thing called Socratic irony, which makes it very hard to read Socrates. It's hard to tell when he's serious, when he's joking, and when he's poking fun or not. It's hard to read that in text. There's human and divine knowledge, the distinction between them. Respect for the rule of law, for the state, right? Not for the masses or the mob, but for Athens. And disdain for rule of majority. Oh, death, virtue, and the good life. So we'll talk about all of these things. And here's how it begins. The opening remarks. I do not know, men of Athens, how my accusers affected you. As for me, I was almost certainly carried away in spite of myself. So persuasively did they speak. And with this, Western philosophy begins. This is the sentence, this is the work that starts it all, that begins the ball rolling. And yet hardly anything of what is said is true. Of the many lies they told, one in particular surprised me, namely that you should be careful not to be deceived by an accomplished speaker like me. From me you'll hear the whole truth, though not by Zeus, gentlemen, expressed and embroidered in stylized phrases like theirs, but in things spoken at random and expressed in the first words that come to mind. For I put my trust in the justice of what I say, and let none of you expect anything else. Super cool. So Socrates admits that he's a poor speaker. And do you think he's a poor speaker? Was that not just like the most badass way to start a speech? Right? So Socrates says he's a poor speaker and he's just going to be conversational and chatty and have a good time with you guys. His interest is in content, the truth, the justice speaking through him, right? The muse, oh muse, speak through me, tell me a story of anger, right? The story of Achilles, right? Tell me the story of a man who did a great many things, the Odyssey. Similarly, it's almost as if Socrates is invoking the muse here, but his muse is justice, right? Not the muse of art and story, but here of justice and truth. So it's the truth that's prior to the expression in terms of importance for his thoughts. And yet Socrates' defense is lauded as one of the greatest masterpieces of Western oratory. Here he's saying, I'm not going to talk that well. I'm not nearly as lovely a speaker and orator, rhetorician as Mellitus and Anytus. But there he goes doing it. So like we get the Socratic irony kind of thing, right? This seems pretty heavily laden in irony. Throughout the speech, Socrates adheres to all of the classical rules of speech and rhetoric. And this is kind of true of the dialogues generally, which I find fascinating. This is a side note. Socrates, throughout the dialogues, picks people, like the poets, the craftsmen, and the politicians, and particularly sophists, these like teachers who would go from town to town and teach young men how to be good statesmen, politicians, live virtuous lives, tell them what virtues are. And Socrates is picking fights with these sophists, saying, you don't even know what virtues are. How can you teach them, right? And this is kind of the form of the dialogues as they go on. And what the sophists did is they taught this rhetorical strategy, the style. If you give a speech in the assembly that follows X, Y, and Z form, then you'll convince people. And Socrates says, convincing is not what matters. What matters is the truth. Your rhetoric is crap compared to what actually matters. And his pre-Socratic influences, Heraclitus, Pythagoras, Parmenides, Thales, these philosophers were accused of what was called babbling, because all they spoke about was like, it's all water, it's all fire. They just this like, it is, and it is not, right? It's this nonsensical ontological mess of confused babble. And this was the charge levied against philosophy. And the charge levied against the rhetoricians was that you make, and the sophists, was that you make the worse sound the better, which is what Socrates is accused of here. And all of the Platonic dialogues, as they rail against sophism, against making the worse sound the better, against thinking that just by speaking beautifully you can make things true, they are in that form. They are in the form of perfect rhetorical dialogue that is supposed to be convincing, but they are not just in that form. They are also about the truth, or at least seeking the truth. They never really quite get there. They always end in what's called aporia, which is, I don't know, right? They reach philosophical bedrock. So fun side note. Great. So the accusations, there are two sets of accusations. There's one informal set and one formal set. The formal set are the reason that Socrates is in trial, but Socrates chooses to address informal charges that nobody's accused him of, but that are out there. And so he takes on the burden of dealing in his trial with stuff that doesn't have anything to do with his trial, but really kind of does. It's the politics that we talked about. So the informal accusations, Socrates says, these earlier accusations are more formidable, gentlemen. They have got hold of most of you since childbirth, persuaded you and accused me falsely, saying that there is a man called Socrates, a wise man, a student of all things in the sky and below the earth, who make the worse argument the stronger. And again, this is like the informal charge, the sort of prejudice against Socrates. These young men, Anytus, Mellitus, are accusing this older dude who's been around, who's kind of like a celebrity in his day and his time. Like everybody kind of knows Socrates. There's a play about him by a super famous Greek poet Aristophanes called The Clouds, where Socrates is the main character, and it's in fact brought up in the Apology. And Socrates teaches a young kid to convince his father, even after he like burned down his father's house, that he didn't do it. And it's like it's a comedy, it's a joke. And so Socrates is this like public figure who has this, he's like lampooned by Aristophanes, and the lampooning has a more insidious effect, which is in this informal charge that Socrates addresses here. And in defense of these more formidable charges, because it's the informal, the sort of sentiment of society that is attacking him, and the reason that the formal charges were brought up at all, that Socrates is here, is why Socrates will begin with them, and is also where we get Socrates' origin story. But then there's the formal accusations as well, the reasons that like for all intents and purposes, Socrates is actually at the courthouse in the day that he is. And also, just as another side note, this was a real historical event. We have actual evidence. We have like the court recordings, or like at least like the court documents that prove like there was a trial of Socrates. It happened in 399 BC. He was a real person. He existed. He wasn't just a figment of Plato's imagination. This was an actual event, right? But how it actually went down, it's just up to Plato to tell us. So formal accusations. Socrates is not on trial for the former informal accusations. He brings those up of his own accord, as I mentioned. It's Miletus and Anytus who accuse him of in the formal way, which is 1, Socrates is guilty of corrupting the youth, and 2, of not believing the gods in whom the city believes, but in other new spiritual things. And we'll consider, as Socrates does, the informal charges first. So Socrates says, I am no teacher of virtue. I do not pretend to be wise enough to do so. I don't know what virtues are, and so far nobody else I've talked to does either. So I already mentioned the sophists, right? They would purport to know what virtue is and say, hey, I know what bravery is, what courage is, and I'll teach your son for 10 drachma. And Socrates goes to these people's houses and flirts a little bit, because that's what they did when they had these little philosophical parties in ancient Greece and drank too much wine. And then he would prove them to be stupid and wrong. So Socrates says, I'm no teacher. I don't know what virtues are, but I do have a reputation of being wise. But it is not as you say, like the sophists claim to be wise. The sophists claim to know what courage and piety and goodness are, but I don't. But maybe that's what makes me wise. Turns out that the oracle at Delphi, which is this here, that's like actual, where the top picture is where the oracle was, and the bottom picture is like a reconstruction. They found bones of the oracles here, like little 11 to 14-year-old girls, I think is typically what they were, but they might have been older too. And it's hypothesized that there was volcanic activity underneath the mountain here at Delphi, and that the toxic fumes made these young people go totally nuts, and speak all sorts of strange nonsense, which was taken to be the wisdom of Apollo and Athena or whoever. And it also stunted their growth. So they would have been put in there when they were really young and like remained tiny, which is maybe like another like magical effect. The gods speaking wisdom through these strange enigmatic children who are high on gas, toxic underground earth gas. Anyways, one of these high on toxic underground earth gas oracles says that Socrates is the wisest man in Athens. Whatever does the god mean? What does it mean to speak through the oracle and say that I'm the wisest man in Athens? What is his riddle? I am very conscious that I'm not wise at all. What then does he mean by saying that I am the wisest? For surely the god does not lie. And so this is Socrates' question when his friend Chaerephon comes back from Delphi and says, hey, that crazy girl up on the mountain said you were the smartest one around. Socrates is like, what does that mean? Let me go find out. Let me test this, right? Do some science. And so in virtue of answering this question, Socrates says, I went to one who is reputed to be wise. Then I examined this man. My experience was something like this. I thought that he appeared wise to many people and especially to himself, but he was not. And then I tried to show him that he thought himself wise, but that he was not. And as a result, he came to dislike me, and so did many of the bystanders. So I withdrew myself and thought, I'm wiser than this man. It is likely that neither of us knows anything worthwhile, but he thinks he knows something when he does not, whereas when I do not know, neither do I think I know. So I am likely to be wiser than he to this small extent that I do not think I know what I do not know. And this is like the whole jig of Socrates, right? Socrates in all of these dialogues goes around talking to famous, smart, rich, powerful people and examines them down to a point where it's shown that their position is contradictory or unprovable, and so they can't know, and so they like walk off in a fluster, or they get pissed, or sometimes they have a good time. The Theaetetus is my favorite dialogue. It's like, what is knowledge? And at the end of it, the aphoretic moment, the moment of like, we can't know, we can't go any further, philosophical bedrock, as I've called it, they're both sort of happy with. You see like the true point of the examined life, of this contemplative attitude of getting to a place where we can't ask any more questions, but we've gone this far. At least we know what knowledge isn't up to this point, and it's kind of a beautiful moment. It's great. So this is what Socrates does, and of course it pisses people off when you say, hey, you're saying you're so smart, but actually you're stupid. I didn't say that. You said it yourself. You made yourself look stupid. And so this is why people are unhappy with Socrates and why he's on trial to be murdered. Okay, so the first events against the informal accusations. Socrates questions the politicians and finds that the more renown a politician had, the more ignorant they were, probably the more angry they'd become with him. Socrates then questions the poets, finding that they spew wisdom without being able to explain what they mean. And it's really the bystanders, the people who interpret and read the poetry, that know better even than the poet what the hell the poets are talking about. And Socrates finally questions the craftsmen, finding that they know many skills, but in wisdom, few and less, just as deficient as everybody else. In each case, the bystanders thought that I myself possessed the wisdom that I proved that my interlocutor did not have. What is probable, gentlemen, is that in fact the god is wise, and his oracular response meant that human wisdom is worth little or nothing. And that when he says Socrates is the wisest man among you, he says, this man among you mortals is wisest who, like Socrates, understands that his wisdom is worthless. And so here's another sort of interesting point to bring up, is that in this quote, we see a distinction between the wisdom of the gods and the wisdom of humankind, and the distinction between the two, right? That human wisdom is worth little or nothing, that the best human wisdom might be able to do for us is to write pretty sounding poems to appear full of renown and power in our political hemisphere, or to build really nice chairs and tables and cars and stuff. But what's that really worth when it comes to the truth, to justice, to capital letter virtue, right? Little or nothing. You got to like sit down when you're talking about this stuff for hours on end. So it's worth a little bit to have some human wisdom, but it's the wisdom of the gods, right? Of the gods who speak through those who live the examined life, that inspire them to live that life, to discuss virtue every day, that is worth something. And this wisdom is not the sort of wisdom that we have, but the sort that inspires us to live a philosophical life. So the informal accusation is that Socrates is a wise man who makes the worse argument sound the better. But his defense, that I revealed the worse arguments to be poor, but do not claim to know any better, for human wisdom is worthless. And if I am wise, it is because I am ignorant and claiming to know what I do not. So the difference, the reason that Socrates says he's so wise is just because he doesn't claim to know what he doesn't, when everybody else around him seems to be saying, hey, I know what this is, but they don't actually, right? And wisdom is in this humility, this intellectual humility, which is funny coming from the guy who's saying, oh, I'm not going to talk well, I'm just going to be conversational, and then gives like a perfect formal rhetorical speech that is absolutely badass, right? So he's like being ironic and like real juicy, but I mean, he's kind of right? That you're a jerk and you're wrong if you think you know something when you don't. You're lying to yourself and everybody that you purport to know that you say that you do. And Socrates never claims to know nothing, right? He only claims that he doesn't say that he knows what he doesn't, right? He doesn't claim to have knowledge when it's not there. He doesn't say, I know nothing, right? And there's a big difference here. He's not saying that we ought to empty our minds completely, right? In the Taoist school, which we'll read some Lao Tzu, but later on in the Han Dynasty period, there's this philosopher Liezi, who is supposed to like be able to walk on air and like dive down into the depths of the ocean and like walk through a burning building, all because he's like not thinking, his mind's completely empty. This is a kind of epistemic philosophical position that you might hold that's like a good way to be. Socrates does not. Socrates does not say, I know nothing and we ought to know nothing at all. No, it's just that we don't claim to know what we don't know, right? We abstain from such an action. However, he walks around and engages in the philosophical life, talking about virtues and values, living well in this way, and doing his like question answer thing. Well, what do you think this is? Is it this? Well, if it's that, then could it be this or that? And digging deeper, right? And this process called the elenchus, the Socratic method, Elenchus. The elenchus is a kind of building of knowledge. It's not it doesn't ever give us what courage is or what piety is, but at least it carves away what it's not. And that is maybe worth little, maybe worth nothing, but at least it is part of what it is to live the examined life, to live well, to live the philosophical life. And that's not nothing, right? Practicing the elenchus, practicing philosophical contemplation has some value. And this is what Socrates wants to inspire in all of us. Second defense against the formal accusations. So the first charge is corrupting the youth, right? So he gives this argument to justly charge one of corruption, one would have to know what corruption means. So here we go. Here's a concept, corruption, and Socrates is going to say, do you even know what that word means that you're using, that you're accusing me of? And it's going to turn out that Miletus doesn't actually know. Miletus claims that Socrates is the only corrupter in all of Athens, which proves that Miletus knows nothing about corruption or the improvement of youth. If there's only one person that does bad stuff, and it's a ridiculous, it's the Reductio Ad Absurdum is the Latin term for the kind of argument that this is, which is to say that the argument commits one to an impossibility, or at least it would force you to investigate infinitely, that you have no like sound ground for your premises. So what Socrates does, he says, look, I can't be the only one in Athens that does any sort of corruption. There's other people that are doing bad stuff too, but you've accused me of being the only corrupter in Athens. And so here's the facts and here's what you've said. And this clearly shows that you have no idea what the heck you're talking about. So conclusion, the first charge is unjust. Socrates, then all the Athenians, it seems, make the young into fine good men except me, and I alone corrupt them. Miletus, that is most definitely what I mean. Socrates, it would be a very happy state of affairs if only one person corrupted the youth, while others improved them. You have made it sufficiently obvious, Miletus, that you have never had any concern for our youth. You show your indifference clearly, that you have given no thought to the subjects about which you bring to trial. And then there's a second argument that Socrates gives in defense of the corrupting the youth charge. One, wicked people do harm to those closest to them, and good people do good to those closest, right? This makes sense. If you're a good person, the people around you will be inspired, influenced by you. If you're a bad person, the people around you will be influenced, inspired by you, and go in one direction or the other. No person who exists would rather be harmed than benefited by their associates. Even if it's kind of like a strange masochism, there's always like the hedonic side of things, or some other like upshot, right? We're not like going around trying to be Nicolas Cage and leaving Las Vegas, typically speaking, at least, right? We're not trying to like ruin ourselves. We want to be around good people, or at least we want to like be around people who make us feel good. Therefore, either I, Socrates, corrupt the youth willingly or unwillingly, meaning that I am willingly hanging out with people trying to make them worse, or I'm making them worse, but I don't mean it. It's like an accident. I can't help it. It's happening. If it's the case that I'm willingly corrupting the youth, then Socrates is willingly harming himself by corrupting his associates, right? That if he's willingly doing harm to the people that are around him all the time, then they're around him all the time and they're going to be corrupted and corrupt him. And nobody wants to be corrupted. Nobody wants to be harmed. and especially by one's associates. So he couldn't willingly corrupt his friends and his youthful entourage, right? Conclusion one, couldn't willingly harm because it would mean that he would be harming himself, and that just doesn't work according to premise two. However, if B, because this is a disjunction, right? So it's either the case that he's doing it willingly or unwillingly. So in order to refute the argument, if the argument is set up as a disjunction, you have to disprove both of the horns, the prongs of the disjunction. So we've shown that A means if A, then I'm not at fault, but if B is still an open question. So if B, then Socrates might indeed be harming his associates without realizing it. He might be doing harm to his entourage, but it's unwilling. Turns out that there's no witness reports from the youth as to have been corrupted by Socrates. Socrates says, hey, is anybody around who feels like they got corrupted by me? Go ahead, raise your hand. And nobody raises their hand. Therefore, Socrates neither willingly nor unwillingly corrupts the youth. And even if it was unwilling, then it'd be hard to like commit a person to death for that. It'd be a little silly. So turns out that according to Socrates, he's not corrupting the youth. But there's a second formal charge that Socrates worships false gods, or he's an atheist. And it's both together. Again, this is like a disjunction, which is part of the stupidity of the claim that Socrates brings up. So Socrates has Meletus explain what he means by worshiping false gods, right? Because you've accused me of worshiping false gods. You've also accused me of corrupting the youth. You obviously don't know what corruption is. Do you even know what worshiping false gods is? And Meletus says that he's accusing Socrates of being an atheist. So he's like, aha, I cannot rightly be accused of believing in gods and being an atheist and believing in no gods. This is incoherent. It's a contradiction. Skip that for now. Socrates stands his ground. Whoa. So what Socrates says is, look, if your brave leader ordered you into war, would you follow her command? Would you be like the French revolutionaries following justice onto the battlefield? If God has sanctioned Socrates in his philosophical mission to examine the wisdom of others, then he, like the good soldier, must follow those orders, right? So he's not an atheist, clearly. He does believe in some sort of power that speaks through him that inspires him to live the philosophical life. But is it a false God? Is it leading him to do bad things? Is it causing him to harm the city because he's listening to this voice leading him on? Well, death be damned if it means forsaking the will of God and living the examined life, says Socrates. Socrates says, look, if what the God tells me is that I need to live this way and do this, and you, the city, the polis, says, because you are following God's orders, divine command or whatever, we're going to kill you, then I've still done everything right, says Socrates. I can't be at fault. At least I'll be right in the eyes of what matters. So Socrates argues that I may choose to die by defying my accusers. You want me to follow the dogmatic traditions of your pantheistic order when really I'm following the God, right? The voice of virtue and justice that inspires. So this isn't like the Christian God. There's no Christian God yet, but just the voice that inspires the life examined in virtue. So Socrates says, I may choose to die by defying my accusers, or I can disobey the God who bade me examine life and live philosophically. But I know that disobeying the God is an evil, surely. I don't know that death is an evil. I can't say it. So it would be better for me to choose what I do not know is an evil before I choose what I certainly know is an evil, right? So if I know that betraying my conscience is certainly bad, but it causes me to die, well, I don't know that death is necessarily all that bad. I'd rather live true to my conscience and find out whether death is bad than do something I know is awful and die eventually anyways. Therefore, I would choose death before giving up the examined life. Right? So living the philosophical life according to Socrates is preeminent even to the will to live, right? That this is what is essential. This is what is important, to live by one's conscience, to talk about virtue every day, to examine, to engage in the elentic method, to seek wisdom, the wisdom of the gods, even if human wisdom is worth little or nothing. And so Socrates refuses to back down to the second charge. He doesn't quite respond to it. He doesn't quite say, I'm not worshiping false gods. What he is saying is that the God or gods that I follow that lead me on are leading me on to do good things. They're leading me on to live this philosophical life, to live an examined life, to live well, and to be better, to make the world better. And whether or not you think that is an admission of a crime worthy of death doesn't matter to me. Think it, don't think it. I will die and I will live by my conscience, or I will just live by my conscience if you agree with me. It's brave, right? There he is. He's not forsaking his conscience. And here we can begin to see some Christian and Socratic overlap. There's a whole lot of it. I mean, this dialogue, Plato's Apology, is very much like the last day and night of Jesus, right, in the garden, and speaking to Father and asking not to die, but then like resolving himself to it, continuing to pick up the cross. I mean, there's all sorts of like death for the sake of virtue, suffering for the sake of conscience, right? Overlaps here. That there's a liberation and a freedom of the Christian soul through the death of Christ, assuming that Christ is resurrected, right? And similarly for the philosophical life, there is a release, expansion, a sanctification of reason and of discussing virtue, of living the examined life that comes from the death of Socrates. And we'll see more of this as we sort of layer in, but this is, I think, the first place that you really start to get a sense of the under the covers kind of spiritual side to the Apology. Even if it's not like theistic or religious, there's like a spiritual human power going on. So by the narrowest of margins, 30 votes out of like 300, the jury votes to convict. Socrates, you are guilty. And it's really only because 3 popular guys got together and like banded their friends and said, hey, you better do this, right? Better vote to convict. But the trial's not over, right? So there's first the apology, the defense, and then the conviction, guilty or not guilty, and then it's the trading of punishments. So the prosecutor says, I want this to be the punishment, and then the defendant gets to say, I want this to be the punishment, and then the jury will vote again, deciding between one of these 2 options. So Meletus and Anytus, Socrates' accusers, offer a penalty of death. They say, I want that guy dead. Socrates says in response to this, pay me money each year and feed me alongside the Olympians in the Prytaneum. So the Prytaneum is like this really fancy, awesome building where all of the like gold medal athletes, these like beautiful young Athenian like people hang out and eat. And Socrates wants to be given a stipend so that he can live comfortably for the rest of his life and look up all of these Olympiad winners togas, because that's what he's interested in, and eat for free, like great food. That should be my punishment. You've convicted me guilty of living an examined life. Now pay me money and put me in the Prytaneum with all these beautiful young discus throwers. And I mean, this is like, if anything is ironic in the dialogues, it is most certainly this. He's just like spitting in the face of Meletus and Anytus. Put that, whoa. Yeah, huge middle finger. But again, it's Socrates just standing up for himself, standing up for what he knows to be right. It's not in the interpretation in your reading, which is a good interpretation, but the translation in the Plato Bible here uses daimon, which is like there's a little spirit that guides me. So if you're familiar at all with Aristotle's Ethics, which you will be about halfway through the semester, he talks about eudaimonia, the state of like virtue, pleasure, where like everything is well and good, that you're living well. You is happiness, daimon is like your spirit, your conscience, basically that voice that says, hey, you should do this. Socrates almost anthropomorphizes his daimon, his conscience, in saying that this is what's telling me to be what I am. And he does not forsake it at any point, even after being convicted of death. And Socrates admits, like, look, like maybe I should say, banish me, send me away, make me go north to the Pythians or south to the Spartans, and doesn't really matter. For one, I'm an Athenian through and through, that I respect the city, and if it's the city that tells me that I'm going to die, then I follow its orders because that is who I am, an Athenian, and I follow the rule of law consistent with his political message, which is what the subject of the next dialogue in the series is, the Credo. But if he is banished, then he will piss people off wherever he goes, and then he'll be accused of death again and be banished again, and he doesn't want to live his life wandering around from town to town being accused of death and banished and all of this. It's too much, so let's nip it in the bud. And he's poor, he can't afford a fine, so he's not going to offer a fine. He has no money. He walks around poking people, rich, powerful people, for fun all day. He can't even afford shoes, right? So he can't afford a fine. Perhaps some might say, but Socrates, if you leave us, will you not be able to live quietly without talking? Now, this is the most difficult point on which to convince some of you. If I say that it is impossible for me to keep quiet because that means disobeying the God, you will not believe me, and you will think that I'm being ironical, saying like, look, if you say like you're free, just stop doing what you're doing, stop making fun of these people, stop being the gadfly. He calls himself a gadfly because he's landing on people and biting them. Like, whoa, wake up. If we let you go, Socrates, just stop talking. And no, but his daimon makes him live the examined life. He can't just give up. Perhaps the God isn't the real reason then. On the other hand, if I say that it is the greatest good for man to discuss virtue every day, and those other things about which you hear me conversing and testing myself and others, for the unexamined life is not worth living, men, you will believe me even less. So what Socrates says in these pair of quotes, I think is really interesting. Throughout the whole dialogue, Socrates has been saying, look, it's the gods, it's the voice of justice speaking through me, inspiring me to seek truth, to live the examined life. Well, if I say that it's impossible for me to keep quiet because that means disobeying the God, you will not believe me and you think I'm being ironical. So he says, look, if it's the case that if I were to defend myself by saying I'm inspired and led on to live my destiny, to live out my fate because it's what the gods determine, he would say, you loser, nobody lives that way. We all like think we have free will, and you can decide to do what you want to do. And it's not like you're a puppet, being led by strings. And so Socrates, in the way that I read it, so this, I don't think that you ought to read it this way. This is like my interpretation, right? So the way that I read this statement is that Socrates is taking his own reasoning here to be ironical or to be questionable, saying like, look, I've been saying this and you've been saying this, like, hey, we're all good God-fearing Christians. But really, if we like talk to each other, like it's kind of a joke. We just say that, right? In God we trust. But it's being ironical. You don't actually believe me all the way through. But on the other hand, if I say that it is the greatest good for man to discuss virtue every day and those other things about which you hear me conversing, the unexamined life is not worth living for men, you will believe me even less. So this there seems to be, at least to me, a prior, deeper reason, a more important one, a deeper, more powerful, below the surface of what is presented on its face as how one ought to live in Athenian society by the will of the gods, but rather instead, for the sake of living an examined life, not living an unexamined life, that discussing virtue every day is what's actually good. And here, if we accept my interpretation that it's not actually the gods or the daimon, the conscience speaking through that really actually impels Socrates to be who he is, but rather Socrates believes that regardless of all else, what matters is living an examined life, and that is what's good. We have a first claim that is positive. This is like, I know something, right? It's not expressed as if I know that living the examined life is what we all ought to do. It's given in the shadow of that positive statement is given, that if I said that, you believe me even less, right? We get an outline of a truth claim rather than a real robust one, which is again in keeping with the Socratic mission. But still, it really tastes a lot like, to me at least, it tastes a lot like a positive truth claim, that I do actually know that the examined life is worth living, that discussing virtue every day is the best way to live, and how we do well and live well in the world, which I think is awesome. So again, by less than a narrow margin, because now he's asked for food and money in the Prytaneum, he's sentenced to death. Like the rest of these things, like, all right, screw you back. So Socrates says, I leave you now, condemned to death by you, but you are condemned by truth to wickedness and injustice. Oh, snap. That's spicy. Like, what's worse? To be condemned by truth to wickedness and injustice, or to be condemned to death? And here we have the final argument of the apology, this sort of beautiful moment that caps everything off, which is that death is nothing to fear. That what we've heard earlier is that I don't know if death is something to fear. And here is an argument now that he's actually convicted and given a punishment of death, that he will examine that question. So the final argument. 1, either the dead are nothing and have no perception of anything. It's a dreamless sleep. Or the soul relocates to a new place. One or the other. We have a soul, we don't. 2, if I have no perception, then death is like a dreamless sleep, an enjoyable fate. But if my soul, on the other hand, this is again like the disjunction, right? We have 2 prongs. So he presents premise 1 as both prongs, and now he's examining either option as a possible way of considering or of dialoguing, of engaging with the question. So if I have no perception, then death is like a dreamless sleep, prong 1. But prong 2, if my soul migrates to a new place, then I may communicate and examine the souls of all those others who have already died. I can talk to Ajax, the greater, the minor, talk to Agamemnon and that son of Thetis, Achilles, and his lover, brother, awesome man-in-arms, Patroclus, and continue to live the philosophical life even in death. And this would be an enjoyable fate. So either, right, Socrates lives, he dies, and it's a dreamless sleep, and there's no pain in dreamless sleep. There's just calm, empty repose. Or he gets to continue to live the philosophical life on what Dante would call the first plane of hell, a plane of sort of like, I can't remember the name of it. Well, in Dante's Inferno, 3 is like the first layer of the 7 or so layers of hell that there are. And it's just a bunch of ghosts wandering around, and eventually sometimes they talk to each other. It's for the like apostates, people who like lived well but didn't actually believe in God or weren't baptized. Anyways, these are like the 2 options for Socrates, and both of them sound pretty good. Therefore, death is not to be feared. So in premise 1, we get this is all that death is. This is the entirety of possibilities, possible space that death could exist in. If we're talking about death, this is what we mean. And for all of those those possibilities for the entirety of the logical space that exists under the heading of the concept of death, we have sort of positive outcomes. I get to keep living an examined life, or I have a dreamless sleep. Therefore, death is not to be feared. To fear death is a kind of ignorance. Because insofar as we fear it, we commit ourselves to knowing that death is worth fearing. But Socrates, and indeed all of us, cannot know what lies on the other side of death. And we can't know it with any certainty for sure, because it's something very different from what we're doing right now. This it is stuff, as Parmenides might have it. The it is not that lies on the other side, it's unreachable, at least in the terms of the it is the living sort of thing. And so to say that we fear death is to posit something of death, is to say that we know something about it, that there's something scary about it, there's something not good, when we don't. And to make this kind of claim is to be like one of the politicians, one of the poets, one of the craftsmen who claim to know what they do not know. And so we are better not to fear death, but instead to examine it, to live the examined life, to question it, to wonder about it, to try and reach the limit approaching truth when it comes to what death is. So finally, we come to answering our question. What is the philosophical life? Well, it's an examined life. It's one where we don't claim to know what we don't know, but we seek out the wisdom that we are yet to have. We look and we ask and we examine. We seek out the highest good through this examining, through this questioning, and through communicating with one another by learning together. We discuss virtue and being and living together every day with those of us who might be willing and able to offer their wisdom. We remain courageous in the face of the frightening consequences of the world, and we hold ourselves to the ground that is our conscience against those fears and consequences with humility and with curiosity. And that is what it is to live the philosophical life. And as we go through the semester, we will read philosophers who share in just this practice, who live this way, who live an examined life and pick their own questions and try to answer them. Some are more convincing than others, but all of them are interesting, and all of them are inspired by Plato's Apology. If not directly, probably always directly, everybody kind of reads Plato's Apology, just like everybody these days reads Descartes' Meditations. You can't escape it. You can't escape the Apology either, because this is where philosophy begins. It's where we get the examined life for the very first time, and the unexamined life is not worth living. And so for the rest of the semester, we'll live a life worth living together. It'll be great. Okay, so that's the end. Interesting time to end with the weather as it is. Can you guys online hear the rain, by the way? No? Yes? I just see a thumb. Does that mean, okay, well, whatever. Remember, email me. I promise to fill out my course eval for 1% of your grade. You get a whole point. It'll be fun to see like how many I get and then how many actually do their evals at the end. But yeah, extra credit that way. And I will see you all next week. So most of the lectures will have more chance for like interaction and participation, but sort of skip that this time for the sake of time and whatnot. But yeah, see you next week. Have a good week. Keep doing discussion boards and stuff.
Thank you.